Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our talk on the legislation and what's going on in animal research. And let me, as y'all are coming in, talk to you about some of the housekeeping things that y'all have probably heard 15 times by now, but please silence your phones. Photography of ABRF meeting sessions is permitted, subject to the speaker's request not to capture pre-publication information. Recordings of the program sessions will be available on the meeting website following the annual meeting. ABRF's social media policy is that everything can be shared. If a speaker asks that it not be shared, please respect the speaker and do not post any of the social media. Hashtag for the event is hashtag ABRF 2026. Unless noted by the speaker, questions are to be held until the end of the session. Attendees may ask questions at the microphone. So there's 2 microphones that if y'all have questions at the end, come and speak in the microphone so everyone can hear. If you haven't already, download the ABRF meeting app to view the full schedule. access the lightning talks, poster abstracts, and all kinds of other information. And all attendees will be receiving an overall meeting evaluation survey following the meeting. Please, please, please fill out the survey. Help us bring you another wonderful meeting next year. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're talking about today. So we have Susan Harper and Sally Thompson-Iritani joining us today. And they're going to tell us a little bit about the legislative landscape of animal research, what's new and what's coming. So as many of us in research support services know, this is a rapidly evolving space. It's being shifted by federal priorities and policies, regulatory expectations, the public perceptions, and continuing push to advance animal welfare while still enabling impactful scientific discovery. So understanding this landscape is essential for anticipating changes, preparing our institutions, and ensuring we advocate for responsible and ethical research. Today we have Dr. Sally Thompson-Iritani, who's the Assistant Vice Provost of Animal Care, Outreach, and the 3 Rs, and a Clinical Associate Professor at the University of Washington's Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences. She is also a board member of SCAW. Her background spans biotech, pharmaceutical, and academic sectors, and she's deeply committed to reducing regulatory burden through standardization, advancing positive reinforcement training, and elevating the human-animal bond as a cornerstone of compassionate care. We also have Dr. Susan Harper, who is a veterinarian and consultant whose career has spanned animal health, public health, biosafety, and federal research oversight. She also currently serves on the board of trustees for SCAW, which is the Scientists Center for Animal Welfare. And she is committed to advancing the humane, ethical, and scientifically sound animal research. So a little bit about SCAW, and if you want to know more information, Dr. Harper and Dr. Thompson-Iritani has brought some information about SCAW that you can see. They have a schedule of activities for 2026, which includes IACUC training workshops and the winter conference that's held at the Meager Hotel in San Antonio. They also have a brochure on information about becoming an institutional member of SCAW. So SCAW is one of the most influential organizations dedicated to promoting humane animal care, high-quality science, and responsible research policy. So it brings together scientists, veterinarians, IACUC members, policymakers, and the public. It provides balanced, evidence-based educational programs, supports institutions through resources on compliance, ethics, and best practices, facilitates national dialogue on emerging issues in animal welfare and regulations, and ensures the scientific advancement proceeds hand in hand with humane care of animals. So with that, I'm going to let the speakers take over. Thank you.
I'm not sure where to stand that you can hear me and also see me. The podium's a little bit high. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. So first of all, I do want to thank the organizers for inviting us to this meeting. This is my first time attending the ABRF, and I'm really impressed with the organization that went into this meeting and also how well we've been received and welcomed. And also the meeting theme that you've selected for this meeting dovetails nicely with what my name is Susan Harper, and this is Sally Thompson-Iritani, who's going to speak after me. But it dovetails nicely with what we're going to talk about. particularly where the intersection of scientific need, emerging technologies, and evolving expectations, and how animal research fits into that bigger picture. So I'm going to focus on some of the legislation that's in place for animal protections, and also what's evolving on the federal landscape, and also some of the states. And I spent most of my professional career, I started off in private practice, but then I went into research, and I was in academia for a short period of time before I went into federal service, and I spent most of my career in the federal service. I left last September. Don't have any interesting stories about leaving. It was just time for me to go. And I've worked at several different agencies. So I've kind of seen behind the curtain and kind of have dealt with Congress in some of my positions. So I can, it's interesting to talk about this topic from that perspective. And I'm just curious, how many in the audience actually participate in animal studies, or have done animal studies, or rely on animal studies? Most of you? Okay. Is there anybody, this is a new topic that you're just interested in? Okay, a few people. So you'll have to bear with me because I'm going to go a little bit through the legislative landscape for animal research. So why are animals important to research? And I think this slide sort of sums it up. They're important because many of the scientific questions that we have to answer require a complex living system in order to address it. You can't just do it in a petri dish with tissues or cells or in silica models. You have to have a complex living system in order to be able to answer the question. And a lot of animals that we work with have similarities to the human subjects. So the information is transferable between species. Not all of it, but you can make certain, it does help science advance before you get to the human subjects. And anything that we gain in one species, any knowledge that we gain in one species, usually that information is easily transferable to others. So in the US, the oversight system for doing animal research is not just one law. It's actually a complex network of different, we have legislation at the state, national, and federal level. We have guidelines and policies, and some of those guidelines and policies have the impact of law. And also we have best practices, and that usually originates from professional societies. You just heard about SCAW, but there's a lot of others that also participate in that process. And this is sort of a high-level overview of some of those. We have at the national level, we have the Animal Welfare Act and the Animal Welfare Act regulations. These are enforced by USDA. We also have the Public Health Service Policy, which originates from the Health Research Extension Act of 1985. Those are the two main laws in the US that govern any kind of research that you do with animals. And also we have we have a voluntary accreditation program that's international for animal programs. It's called ALAC International. Some of the institutions that you come from may be accredited. And if you've ever heard of preparing for an ALAC site visit, that's a voluntary process. It's also a confidential process, and it's not governmental. It's an accreditation program that's privately run. And in addition to that, we have a lot of different professional and scientific organizations that are focused on animal welfare and the best way to care for our animals, the best way to do research. A few of those are listed here. We have SCAW, ALAS, ACLAM. We use a lot of acronyms in the animal world, and sometimes it can be confusing because a lot of them sound the same. Also, if anybody has a question about anything I'm talking about, just please draw my attention. You don't have to wait till the end. So in addition to those regulations, those policies, those groups, animal research also has to follow a lot of the rules and laws that are in place for research in general. And these typically focus around safety, waste management, radiation, things like that you may use in animal studies. And you also use them in vitro non-animal studies. the same regulations apply. You can't tease out animal research, and they're not exempt from following any of those rules. You still have to pay attention to those too. So it becomes a little bit complex. And in my previous position, when I was working for one of the federal agencies, my job was split between research safety and animal welfare. And I always enjoyed the safety side of things a little bit more because it seemed like that was an area where there was a lot of need for training. Also, people, most of the major issues that I dealt with concerned individuals working in the lab having accidents or being injured. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about the regulations, the main regulations that we have to follow in the US. So the Animal Welfare Act is the only federal law that specifically protects certain warm-blooded animals that are used in research, or they may be bred for commercial sale. They may be on exhibit. It covers a lot of areas. It's not just focused exclusively on research. And it was first passed in 1966 when President Johnson was in office. And, but it's been amended several times to expand the scope of the law. And as I mentioned before, it's administered by the USDA, in APHIS, which is Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, and there's an office within that group called Animal Care, and they are the ones who enforce this law. And they go out to basically inspect programs to make sure that you're following this law. So the Animal Welfare Act, as I mentioned, applies to warm-blooded animals, and these are vertebrates, dogs, cats, non-human primates, hamsters, gerbils, any farm animals that may be used for biomedical research. The species that it does not cover would be anything like farm animals that are used for agricultural research that we refer to as food and fiber research. Any birds that were bred specifically for use in research, rats and mice that were bred for specific use in research, and also any cold-blooded species. Those are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. And some of the things that the Animal Welfare Act includes information on is the care of these animals, how they should be housed, that you have to have institutional oversight for activities that involve these animals. You have to be licensed and is subject to unannounced inspections by APHIS Animal Care. And if you fail to follow the rules, you're at risk of being fined or possibly losing your license. And I've highlighted two things on this slide that are the most recent changes to the Animal Welfare Act that happened within the last few years. One was that the agency came up with standards for birds that are used in research. Prior to a few years ago, we did not have standards for birds. And again, these are birds that are not bred for use in research. So it would be, if you have a study involving wild birds or songbirds that you capture in the wild, they would be covered. And there are standards for their care now. The second thing is that each institution that works with animals has to have a contingency plan, and a contingency plan is essentially a disaster plan to handle emergencies that you would anticipate might happen to your program that could affect the animals. So those are two new changes. Switching gears now, we'll talk about the Public Health Service policy. And so this is basically if you receive funding from any of the PHS agencies, which include NIH, CDC, FDA, a few other agencies that are not PHS but have agreed to abide by PHS policy, like NASA, Veterans Affairs. So this, if you agree to accept funding from any of these agencies, you are obligated to follow PHS policy, Public Health Service policy. And it's administered by an office at NIH called the Office of Lab Animal Welfare, also called OLAW, the acronyms. It's been in place since 1985 under the Health Research Extension Act, and it uses, in addition to PHS policy, which is relatively short compared to the regulations under the Animal Welfare Act, It also uses the National Research Council Guide for the Care and Use of Animals as its standards for the care of animals that fall under PHS policy. Unlike the Animal Welfare Act, PHS policy covers all vertebrates that are used in research if it's PHS funded. So this includes laboratory-bred mice, rats, and birds. So they were not included under the Animal Welfare Act, but they are included in PHS policy. And it also extends to cold-blooded species. So fish, amphibians, those types of species would be covered, anything that has a vertebrate. Instead of having a not unannounced inspection process, PHS policy depends on institutions to establish an assurance, it's called the Animal Welfare Assurance, with their office, and then to self-report noncompliance. So you're required to self-report anything, any deviations from the policy or the guide to the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare at NIH. You also need to submit annual reports giving a summary of the activities that occurred in the previous year. And you have to recognize that any failure to follow PHS policy could affect the funding that you receive from those agencies. So PHS policies have been a little bit more, had a few more updates, and I think it's because it's a policy and not a regulation, so it's a little bit easier to change. The most recent was in 2025. NIH came out with some guidance on any research that involves chimpanzees. Chimpanzee research is not prohibited, but you can't do anything invasive with chimps. And actually, anything non-invasive, there's limitations on what you can do with them. So it greatly restricts what you can do with that particular species. And it also came up with some statutory requirements that allow evidence-based alternatives that are consistent with PHS policy to be used instead of following precisely what's written in the guide or PHS policy. These are referred to as performance standards. And in January 2026, they issued some additional guidance on how they define what prompt reporting is. So as I mentioned before, if you have a deviation from PHS policy or the guide, you're required to report that, self-report that to NIH. And so they've come out with more, to clarify what their expectations are in terms of the timeliness of those reports, what should be included in those reports, what they consider to be reportable, what is not reportable. And in essence, they want you to give a verbal report at the time, in real time as much as possible when the incident has occurred or the event has occurred, and then to follow up with a written report. And this information does go to NIH. Once that information is given to NIH, that information can be requested through FOIA because it's a federal agency. So when you do submit those reports, you want to make sure that you have all the information correct and that it accurately captures what happened. Also, they clarified that your institutional official, which is the individual who's assigned primary responsibility for your animal program, that individual's signature on any documents that go to NIH verify that your institution is complying with PHS policy and as a condition of funding. And so if they determine that that's not the case, that's the individual who has to explain why you're doing things the way you are. And that's the person they refer to as the go-to-jail person, your institutional official. So that sort of covers the federal regulations. And in addition to that, we also have state and local regulations. And these vary from state to state. There's a lot of variation across the US. And so when you're doing compliance planning, you need to be geographically specific for what applies to your program depending on where you're located. In addition to the federal regulations, you may have some state or local regulations that also apply to your program. And these include things like some states have mandatory adoption laws for certain animals. Once you're finished with the research, if they're adoptable, then you're required to make every effort to adopt those animals out if they're healthy and they are suited for adoption. Also, there's maybe restrictions on certain types of activities that can take place in your state. Some states forbid any testing of cosmetics in animals. And your local controls also will affect zoning, where you can actually build your facilities, what you can do in those facilities. If you're working in collaboration with any shelter animals, those are usually covered under local jurisdiction. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been going on in DC for the past year. So starting in February 2025, Congress introduced the CARGO Act. And CARGO stands for Cease Animal Research Overseas Act. Cease Animal Research Grants Overseas Act. So basically what this act proposes to do is to prohibit NIH from funding any types of animal research that's conducted overseas, outside the domestic US. And also, this has kind of evolved from recent events where it was determined or felt that studies that were taking place outside the boundaries of the US didn't have as much oversight as those taking place in the US. So this law was introduced. It did have bipartisan support. It's been introduced, but it hasn't moved to committee, so it's sort of just in a holding pattern for right now. Also, in February 2025, the HEARTS Act was introduced. And there's a lot of variation on HEARTS Act, I found when I Googled this. But this one stands for Humane and Existing Alternatives in Research and Testing Sciences Act. And so basically, this legislation is also a bipartisan effort, and it reinforces the idea that the federal system is trying to formalize new approach methodologies, also called NAMs. I'm sure you've heard that acronym before. It has a lot of different definitions, but for federal purposes, they refer to it as new approach methodologies. And for treating them as something that's actually a high priority when you're designing a research study rather than just an afterthought. And so this legislation is also, it was introduced, has not been advanced to committee yet, so it's also in a holding pattern. So both of these acts were introduced early on in the new administration, but they haven't really gotten any traction. And I think that's because, in case you've been paying attention to the news, there's a lot going on. So these are just not at the top of the priorities right now. However, that did not stop the federal agencies from following up on what was some of the intent behind this legislation. So in April 2025, NIH created a new office. It's the Office of Research Innovation, Validation, and Application, called ORIVA. And ORIVA is basically a commitment by NIH to make it a priority to help to coordinate, validate, and create policy and grants that are around what they consider to be human-relevant methods. And a lot of times, when you say human-relevant methods, people interpret that as non-animal methods. That's not necessarily the case, but there is more emphasis on validating some of these in vitro methods that have been that we're looking at and we're getting more data on, so we understand how they work better. It's not intended to absolutely eliminate animal testing, but it is putting a push on coming up with new methods. And in April 2025, FDA also announced its plans that it intends to eventually phase out animal testing right now for new product approval. Right now, there's a requirement for whenever a product gets approved from FDA, you have to show, first of all, that it does what it proposes or states that it does, and also that it's safe to administer to populations of people. And so a lot of the toxicity testing is done in animal models. They have requirements for certain series of tests that have to be done to meet these requirements. And so they're looking more at, are there substitute tests available that we do not have to do all these animal tests? and with the goal of eventually phasing out animal tests altogether. So, it was a busy year, wasn't it? In July 2025, NIH also changed some of the funding strategies for the research that it sponsors, and it's moving away from grants or funding calls that are explicitly directed towards animal model development. That no longer has to be part of the grant application process. There used to be a subset of grants that were totally directed at that type of activity, and now it's not a requirement anymore. They've done away with that funding stream. In October 2025, FDA again came out with a proposal to streamline non-clinical studies and accept any validated NAMs that have shown that they can take the place of animal data. So now you do not have to produce the animal data. If you have NAMs data that's been validated, you can submit that in place of animal data. So what this does is it provides a lot more flexibility for sponsors who are introducing products. Theoretically, it shortens the development timeline because usually in vitro assays can be performed more quickly than an animal study. It also reduces costs. Animal studies are relatively expensive to perform compared to most in vitro studies. And it's also, it gives credit to supporting broader implementation of the 3 R's. And does everybody know what I mean when I say the 3 R's? Okay, replacement, reduction, and refinement of animal studies. So by putting the emphasis on in vitro studies, that way you are taking a big step towards implementing the 3 R's as it was intended to be. And in December 2025, there was an announcement that there was also a multi-agency strike force that was being developed. And so what this involves are 3 federal agencies: Department of Health and Human Services, USDA, and Department of Justice. And what it involves is that, first of all, there's Department of Justice is putting a federal attorney in each state, and that attorney's primary responsibilities are to prosecute cases involving animal welfare. And so this is not specifically directed at animal research because animal research, as we talked about a little bit earlier, there are certain oversight mechanisms that prevent animals being misused or mistreated or neglected if they're being used in research. It focuses on animals, the bigger picture of animals, things like puppy mills, dog fighting, and things like that. But because the Department of Health and Human Services is involved and they would not really have oversight of any of those types of activities involving animals, there is sort of an implication that if a research program or a vendor who's providing animals to research is mistreating or neglecting their animals, that they could be prosecuted under federal law. And most recently, February 2026, the Oregon Health Sciences University's board, so that there are national regional primate centers across the U.S. There's, I think, 6 of them. Is that right? 7, okay. 7 of them, and Oregon has 1. So their primate center, the board that operates that primate center has authorized the institution to enter into negotiations with NIH to transition from a research program into a sanctuary established to house animals that have been retired from research. And so they would not be doing research anymore, but they would be receiving retired research animals. Also in February 2026, USDA APHIS Animal Care put out for a request for information. They're in the process right now of changing standards for the housing of dogs that are used in breeding. And so this would include private breeders that have kennels where you're producing dogs for the pet trade, but also if you are in a commercial facility that's producing dogs for research, this might also affect those programs. So they're looking at, they're asking the public to provide comment on how the standards for dog care should be changed, including exercise and socialization opportunities for these dogs. Again, I think the primary emphasis with this regulation is focused on puppy mills. However, it does not specifically exempt research, so it may have some implications for research animals. In March 2026, FDA, if you recall, they had announced their plans to move away from animal testing. So now in March 2026, they actually introduced guidance for sponsors of drugs on what their expectations are for using in vitro methods instead of animal testing. What's the process for validating these methods to show that they have results similar or equivalent to animal tests, and how to go about getting these models in support of approvals. And the area that they're mostly focused on is called predictive toxicology. Okay, so that's sort of a wrap up of what's going on in the regulatory arena. There's been a lot of activity, and I think the main thing is that even though the regulations have not actually made it through Congress, there's been a lot of movement in federal programs and federal facilities to voluntarily adopt what was proposed as legislation. And so, so what does that mean to the future of animal research, right? It doesn't sound very good at this point. I think we can all agree that animal use in general will continue to decline, and it's not just a result of these recent regulatory actions or policy actions. The use of animals has actually been steadily going down over the years. It may accelerate a little bit now, but it's going to continue. The use of animals is going to continue to go down. Many of the species that were once very commonly used for animal tests are being replaced by animals that are lower on the phylogenetic scale. So instead of using dogs, which are rarely used, it's moving more towards mice or zebrafish. So your less advanced species are actually the most commonly used right now for most assays. And also, you know, a lot of vendors, a lot of researchers are moving towards broader reliance on refined technologies for their research. And so they are eliminating the animal component. However, that does not mean that we are totally finished with animal research. Animal research still has a place in science, and animal models are still critical. And that's just because, for the reasons I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the whole body complexity is still critical to a lot of science. You can't possibly duplicate that in silica or computational models or in vitro methods. Animals provide integrated physiology. If you want to see immune responses, pharmacokinetics data, metabolism, behavior, and long-term effects across a variety of organ systems instead of just one specific organ, a target organ, you still actually have to do animal studies in most cases to get that data. And so while many of we're making great progress with non-animal models, there's still some validation gaps in some areas that we need to fill in. And also the predictive limits for chronic conditions such as chronic disease, toxicity, or any species-specific questions, we still probably have to go to the animal to get the final answer. And I come from a little bit of an agricultural background, and I always have to emphasize to people that most of the NAMs that are being validated they're being validated for human assays. They're not being validated for other animal assays. So if you're producing any kind of product that's intended to be used in animals, we don't have NAMs for most of the species right now that that's appropriate for. So there's still a big limitation if you're a veterinarian. And so the 3 R's still hold a critical role in this whole overall process, and they're a lot of what's guiding innovation and the development of these new assays. Replacement is advancing through organ-on-chip systems. You have AI and machine learning that's really helping a lot, organoids, digital twins. Reduction is advancing through smarter experimental design, shared databases, and refinement is always improving. We have better analgesia now than we've had in the past for animals that are on study. We look a lot at low stress handling versus how things were done in the past that may not have taken that into consideration as a potential variable or stressor. Enrichment helps make the lives of animals that are used in science better. And just constant training of individuals who work with animals to make them aware of these factors. So some of the animal welfare advancements that you see coming out are actually very practical. We have systems now where you can do real-time monitoring of animals, and that's inside the cage. You do not have to remove the cage and go look at the animal. You're able to view it at from your desk through technology that gives you a cage-level view of the animal. Also, improved husbandry. We're always working to try to figure out a better way to house animals and how to care for them. And humane disposition strategies, just like the primate sanctuary that I talked about. You know, it used to be that all animal studies were terminal studies, and that's not the case anymore. And also quality of life assessment throughout the whole study life cycle. We have big emphasis on humane endpoints when it's time for an animal to exit a study. So all those are considerations that go into studies that are being conducted today. And also, technologies and policies continue to evolve. The next phase is likely to be more validation and scaling of the new approach methodologies, NAMs. Building larger data sets that can be shared across institutions and across labs, strengthening the regulatory tools so that the validation process is clearer and easier to follow. And as these systems continue to mature, institutions that are going to be successful are the ones that can combine scientific rigor, transparent data practices, and also are fluent in the changing regulations as the regulations continue to evolve. So that brings me to a little plug for SCAW, which is the Scientist Center for Animal Welfare. Now, that's the organization that Sally and I are representing, and Sally's going to tell you a lot more about the very rich history of SCAW. But I'm going to give you, we do have pamphlets on SCAW that I encourage you to take with you. And so how does SCAW fit into all this? And it's an organization that's totally focused on education and looking at evolving trends. So we try to educate the field, and we convene stakeholders to do that. So people who are actually doing the work to get their opinions and also their thoughts. We support science-based policy rather than implementing policies that we are not sure if they're going to work or not. They may sound good on paper, but they may not have the effects that you want. So we like to look at the science behind the policies. And we help institutions to build the skills that they need to operate an animal program in today's evolving regulatory landscape. And I would encourage you all to consider, if your institution is not a member, consider becoming a member. Number one reason for that is because the educational opportunities are pretty tremendous. If you're an institutional member, the cost is pretty low considering for the value that you get back. And it's a very welcoming community. If you've ever been to one of our meetings, I'd have to say we like to feel like we're like ABRF, very welcoming, very focused on what you need to get from a meeting to take back to your institution to make your animal care better. And if you care about the future of research and animal welfare and responsible innovation, it's really the place to be. I put in a list of references that sort of back up some of the things I talked about. If you want more information, they should be clickable so they're easy to access. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I'm going to hand off the mic to my colleague, Sally Thompson-Iritani, and then we're happy to answer questions after that. So please, thank you for your attention.
Hello, and thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to kind of stand here so you can actually see me. You'll never see me behind that podium. So welcome, everybody. So appreciative of you coming out this morning, and thank you. They're just pulling up my slides right now. So I am going to go ahead and get started. And thank you to Susan for doing such an amazing overview of where we are at with our legislative landscape. Lots going on, and I'm going to be introducing you to some really hard truths about where we're at with science and with animal research in particular. So the agenda today, and I think it's not responding to my clicker. I think they might be moving some things for me, which is fantastic. There we go. So the agenda today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about these shifts in public perception. Some of these are driving what's going on at our federal and state levels. And some of them are just the public is not at an area of trust with our community right now. And we have to take advantage of an opportunity to regain trust. So I'll be going over the first talk of my talk, like evolving public climate, and then I'll finish up talking more in depth about SCAW, a little bit of the history, contributions, and then where all of you might fit in with the future of this. So the evolving public comment. As I mentioned, I think we're all aware there is a real challenge right now with trust in science. And I recently heard this phrase, which I think is so important, because really trust is ours to gain. We can gain trust with people, but it is also ours to lose. And as of right now, we have lost a lot of trust, and we have to take some responsibility for that. So let's talk about some effective communication strategies and some of the trends that we may all be dealing with. As Sharon had mentioned, I am at the University of Washington. We are a very, very big target for animal activism and anti-research activism. So I have some firsthand experience if anybody has questions about that. So one of the things with my experience is I really want to push us towards this transition from reactive transparency, like, oh, you found this out and we're going to say, like, we're going to, like, respond to it. We want to be proactive. And I think proactive openness is how we are going to regain trust and also how we're going to try to keep it, because again, it is ours to lose. So public trust is dynamic. And as I mentioned, we can gain or lose it. It is not just fixed and immovable. We have an opportunity here, and we need to figure out what this looks like. Again, we all understand there is a declining trust right now in science, but this is shaped by how we communicate. Our openness, our consistency, and our willingness to take accountability, because science is not perfect, and things do fail. And when they fail, we need to be open and honest about that. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to share some information from a survey that was done by the National Academies. It is summarized in this paper, so I just put this here. Currently, you do have copies of all these slides in your app, so you're welcome to take pictures, but if you'd rather just look at them when they're in your app, that is fine also. But this is a national survey where we tried to look at some of the public opinions, particularly regarding animal research. So I'm going to go over just a few of the data points here. There's a lot of information in this publication and a lot of supplementary data. If anybody wants to dig into it further, you are welcome to, and any thoughts or criticisms, please share them. But what I want to focus on first is this summary information, okay? This was in February of 2023, so this is not the most recent survey. There's all sorts of surveys that are out, but they are pretty consistent. And what this shows you here is across what we asked people is in what situations where humans are interacting with animals or actually using animals for food or research or fur or whatever, where do you find these acceptable versus unacceptable? Okay, so as you can see here, what I've outlined in this box are the two areas, particularly regarding research with animals. So the one that's on the bottom is research with animals in laboratories. And what this shows is that 44% of the people that were surveyed in a national survey found it acceptable in all or most cases to use animals in research. Now, this used to be much higher, and I think everybody's aware it used to be up even to 80%. So we have lost trust, right? Or maybe we've just changed and it's not acceptable anymore. We need to figure this out. But as you'll see also that there was about 7% of the people who just were not sure, but 50% found it unacceptable in all or most cases. Now, the one right above this is wildlife research, where people are evaluating animals in their natural environments. This was more acceptable, but still not nearly as acceptable as if we are eating animals as for food, right? Protein, we all need protein. That was up at the top there. Hunting animals for a food source, or having animals in zoos, which they found more acceptable. Now, at the bottom here, what you'll see is that using animals for fur, cosmetics testings, or trophy hunting had lower acceptability than animals in research. So this is concerning. So we wanted to understand what was behind this. So further questions asking this, like, where do people go? Who do you trust to get good information about the use of animals in research? And there is some good news here, because I think everyone in the room are going to fall into one of these trusted categories. What we found, veterinarians, scientists, physicians, these are our trusted resource when we want to talk about this information. So we need to get our voices out, because we also are not the people who are out there speaking the most. We're not on social media spreading information as much as some other people. So people are getting their information from sources that they actually don't trust. So again, this is our opportunity to earn trust. So what I'm showing here, and I am going through this pretty quickly, like I said, there's a lot more details in the paper. So we went through a lot of questions and asked people how they felt about different environments of animals in research. And then at the very end, we went back and asked them that same question. How do you feel about animals in research? And what you see here is that at the end of the survey, there was an increase of 11% of the people who found that animals in research was acceptable in all or most cases. So you're going to hopefully ask, or you're thinking, what changed? Well, you might be surprised, maybe not surprised. What people said changed their mind more than anything was knowing that these animals are actually taken care of, that these animals receive humane care, that there's regulations in the care for these animals. They actually weren't as persuaded by the science and the scientific necessity, which I think some people find surprising, because many of our scientists want to talk about the science. They're passionate about it. They know how important it is. But what we found in this, the public actually wants to know about the care. They want to make sure that these animals are being well taken care of while they are supporting the research. So again, this is our opportunity to really say how we take care of these animals. As Susan mentioned, we need to clarify when animals are necessary. They're used when the questions are complex, right? We have complex questions that we cannot answer any other way. And I totally agree. Human relevant, I do not know what that term means. I do not think that we expect one species to be like another. We don't expect something in a dish to be like a person, but I also don't expect that each and every one of us is going to be identical to each other. So there are a lot of differences that we need to evaluate, and we need to recognize that. But we need to make sure that when animals are used in research, this is guided by justification and things that we know with careful consideration, that when these technologies advance, that many of you are supporting, thank you, we're incorporating them whenever we can. So when I was looking at this data, I'm working with my colleague, and we're looking at this data going, what are we missing? How are we as a community going to regain trust? And one of the things that I promote, and one of the things we started talking about, is what's called a SWOT analysis. Just by a show of hands, also because I feel like we need some energy in the room, does everybody know what a SWOT is? Many of you, because I think in shared resources, or any type of things that you guys are doing, you're probably thinking about SWOT a lot. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right? For every program that you do, it's such a valuable analysis to think about these things. Where are the areas where we can really excel, and how can we drive these things forward? So when we did this SWOT analysis for animal research, the one area I really want to focus on and tell you about is this: opportunities. What are our opportunities to advance animal research and regain trust? So, and also, before I go into, really I'm going to focus on that one quadrant, but if you want to know more, you can go to the publication. But we want to use this responsibly, because our strengths, these are not excuses to continue to do things the way we do them. The fact that we have had major successes and animal research has contributed to all of us living longer and healthier, we cannot rest on that. Those are strengths, they're amazing, but they're not excuses. We do not want to condemn our weaknesses, and our opportunities are actual opportunities, they are not hype. And do not panic about the threats. There are a lot of threats out there. We need to consider them, we need to think about them, and we need to be ready for them. So, one of our biggest challenges, why we have so much distrust, is because much of our biomedical research occurs out of public view, right? And what people don't see, like if I don't see something, but I just hear a little bit of information, I start to make things up, because that is the way our brain works. So when all people see is little bits of information, their natural tendency is to put the story together for themselves. Now, I want to be really clear, and I know many of you have very complex facilities that you are not going to give people tours of. You are not going to allow the public in to see them, because there's biosecurity, there's very delicate instruments, you have to avoid contamination. There are many reasons why we don't have everything fully publicly viewable. But in every capacity we can, if we can take that veil away, and if we can provide more accessibility, it is going to increase trust, because it helps people put the full story together. It's not, just a second, I don't know why it's not moving. My clicker doesn't seem to be advancing. There we go. Okay, did I advance? Okay, so just one second. When silence becomes risk, because I clicked it too many times, sorry about that. Again, when it is invisible, it allows others to define us, and we need to be defining it for other people. We live it every day, so we need to share it, and this is where we sometimes come up with challenges. So again, this is why openness matters. Openness is not risk-taking. It is trust-building. One of the most common questions I get is, because we're very open at University of Washington, does openness increase your risk of being a target? And I tell you, I have looked at so many different organizations. Does openness increase our risk, or does it decrease your risk by being more hidden? And there is no correlation. You are going to become a target because somebody has decided to target you. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of rhyme or reason. I just want to mention that. But clear communication is what is going to help guide us. And Susan did such a great job of covering this, because over the last, what has really changed in terms of our environment? And what has changed is a lot of the things that many of you are supporting. What has changed is technology, visibility, expectations. If you work at a state institution and you're getting federal money, people want to know what you are doing with their money, right? They feel like it is their money and they should have a say. That visibility matters. But what hasn't changed is the complexity of biological systems. Biological systems, again, are highly complex. We need to be thinking really seriously about that. So key takeaways for openness is that acceptance is not shaped by trust, not by persuasion, and humane treatment is foundational to credibility. Openness integrates ethics, welfare, and rigor, hopefully all of those things together. Now, I am very quickly going to go through SCAW's contributions, because I want to be sure that we have time for questions and answers. And Susan did a fantastic lead into this for SCAW's contribution and vision. Many of you may not know the Scientists Center for Animal Welfare started in 1979. It was really a catalyst for science-led welfare. And this is not just a history lesson, but it sees like how this organization was monitoring the regulatory landscape and making sure that people were prepared to respond. It was established by research professionals who said, we need to be ready, regulations are changing, how are we going to prepare for this, and how are we going to control the messaging? And the Scientist Center was named deliberately to signal that environment of the scientists' commitment to animal welfare. This in 1981, which was before the regulations that Susan summarized for all of you, was started before those things were in place to prepare us. And the first major conference was in 1981 at Chevy Chase, Maryland, to move the discourse from whether we should use animals to how we do so with clinical excellence and maintaining high animal welfare. In 1984 and 1985, SCAW actually had 5 regional, I would say, kind of area-specific seminars talking about how to prepare for changing regulations. The changing regulations that they were preparing for were the Animal Welfare Act and the composition and how you would work with an IACUC. That's pretty amazing foresight. This shaped a lot of what we do today with our animal care committees. So they saw this opportunity and they drove it forward. So the dual mandate is to make sure that to support our science, we have combined animal welfare with scientific excellence. So again, the pillar, just calling these pillars, they're not formal by SCAW definition, but one of the things is really IACUC proficiency. This is continue to maintain IACUC proficiency, how we can all do our jobs to support the animal research. Advancing the 3 R's, as Susan mentioned, the 3 R's of replacement, reduction, and refinement of the use of animals in research, critical here. And integration of these, like NAMs, whatever you want to call them. Also, I think SCAW is a great resource for being a regulatory liaison because they bring regulators into the conversation so that we can have healthy conversations with them and understand how to implement these. One thing I really want to talk about is a connection with this organization, because this ABRF, which I didn't know about, this is a well-kept secret just for all of you that are here and haven't told me about it before. This is such a great conference, looking at the things that you're presenting and the topics that you're covering. These are so essential, and there actually is some great overlap with SCAW, because this biological stability that many of you are trying to achieve also is something that we look at when we try to maintain animal care up to standard, and welfare as quality control. If we're looking at animal welfare, similar to quality control across any biological mechanism. So really stressing how important these things are. And the reproducibility. I know you all care about reproducibility, and this goes across whether you're working with animals, whether you're working with a petri dish, whatever you're working with, even with our AI systems, which many of us are incorporating, they're not always reproducible, right? So what does that look like, and how can we all work together to maintain this? The other thing that's a clear commitment, I think, across all of our organizations is a culture of care, and not only making sure that we are taking care of the scientific systems that we are working with, we also need to ensure that we are taking care of the people that are working within these systems. And this can be people working with animals, where there's a lot of the human-animal bond we deal with, but I know all of you may be dealing with frustrated scientists also who aren't getting the results they want because something didn't work the way that they thought it was going to. We need to know how to be there for each other and how to deal with these things and build resilience. Again, I would really encourage openness over transparency, being open about what we do, why and how we do it, how can we build trust and then maintain it so we don't lose it, ours to gain, ours to lose. And here are things if you would like to, again, there's handouts, and Susan